should stand up or remain sitting, or probably remain sitting, because to be quite honest, I'm absolutely bricking myself. I used to blog anonymously as Belle De Jour, which is probably how most people better know me. Or perhaps you don't know me at all, because I'll be quite honest, I'm well old now and y'all look frighteningly young. I'm primarily a writer and a scientist. I spent a year and a half as a sex worker in London. I had moved down during my final year in Sheffield around the time that I submitted my thesis, and while I was waiting to be vivaed, was absolutely unemployable at that point, ran out of cash, turned to escorting, as you do or don't, and had an experience where I thought, oh my God, I should be blogging this. And at the time, this was 2003, and blogs weren't quite as common as they are now. I estimate that probably there were about 100 active bloggers in Britain at that time. It really wasn't as popular here as it had been in the States and elsewhere. So it did catch a lot of attention, and it did sort of kick off a massive hunt for who I was, and people assuming that I couldn't be real, that I must be a man or a fantasy or some kind of ploy to get a book deal, which absolutely I was not angling for a book deal at all. I was, however, hoping to get a column in a newspaper, which has only just happened in the last year. So note to self, next time try to have something with a better payoff that comes much faster. As was advertised, I'm primarily going to be talking about legalization and decriminalization of consensual activity. Obviously, I have a personal interest in sex work or prostitution. As a general note, the term sex work is an umbrella term that encompasses all kinds of work within the sex industry, not just prostitution, but also things like being a porn actor, phone sex, cam girls, etc. For the purposes of this talk, where I use sex work, it's going to mean the things that we classically consider to be prostitution, street walking, escorting, courtesan, etc. I'm very much aware of the massive privilege that I have to be able to be open as an ex-sex worker and not be unemployable. There are very few people who've been in sex workers who are also in a position to be able to speak about their experience openly. It's estimated that there are 80,000 sex workers working at any one time in the UK, but these numbers are highly disputed. This comes from a study by Hilary Cannell at the University of Birmingham from over 10 years ago. And she got her data from people who were accessing particular outreach services. So that gives you an idea of quite how limited that is in terms of our knowledge of how many sex workers there are. Some people have estimated that there could be up to 1 million ex-sex workers in Britain alone. Now, this includes both women who have worked in the kind of sex work that I worked in, which is cisgendered, heterosexual sex work, women selling sex to men, but also men who sell sex to men and other forms as well. And it's the kind of field where nobody really has a handle on the numbers, who the people are, but more importantly, how they feel about their work. So when I was asked to come up with a title for this, I kind of went, legalize everything, but obviously that's not quite what I mean. Technically speaking, we actually have legalization of sex work in Britain. It is not illegal per se to exchange sex for money, but there are a lot of activities around it which are criminalized. Very often these affect people who work on the streets. So solicitation, for example, is criminalized in a lot of places, and other similar activities. In some ways, this kind of situation is analogous to previous situations where other activities have been criminalized. You can almost, in a certain sense, and certainly I do, look at the criminalization of activities around sex work and around drug use as being analogous to previous criminalization of things like alcohol drinking in the United States and production, and also homosexuality both in the US and in the UK. Inevitably in this kind of discussion, there are a lot of people who put their hands up and say, I think that sex work, drug use, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, should be legal and heavily regulated. And there are a lot of people who oppose heavy regulation because that then drives people away and into the back alleys. For example, in Nevada, where famously there are legal brothels, over 80% of the sex workers in the state prefer to work illegally than to work in the brothels because it is such a restrictive system. For example, you can't work in Las Vegas, even though everybody does seem to think that it's legal there. You cannot work in a county where your family live. You're only allowed off the premises under the control of the person who owns and manages the brothel, etc. And it's obviously a very problematic system. Similar things are also occurring in the Netherlands, where again, brothels and cameras, which are the window girls, those are legal but subject to very hard restrictions, and an increasing number of sex workers in the Netherlands prefer to work outside of those strictures where they have more control over what they're doing. So really, what would be the point of decriminalizing things that perhaps in a previous generation were classed as victimless crimes? Well, certainly, prison numbers have a lot to do with it. So in 2009, the US federal prison population actually passed the point at which the majority of prisoners were there for drug offenses. So over 50% of the people who are incarcerated in the US are there for drug use or drug sale offenses, with another 30% who are incarcerated for public order offenses, being drunk in public, basically, which means that over 80% of the population of prison inmates in the US are perpetrators of what would be known as victimless crimes. And this is a number that's exploded since 1980, since Reagan came to office. We've got to ask ourselves, when we look at the proportion of the US population who are in prison, are Americans 5 times more likely to be criminals than the rest of the world's populations because they're imprisoning at a rate that is 5 times higher than the rest of the world? Well, obviously not. This has to do a lot with what we consider to be legal and illegal, and criminal and not criminal. The situation in England and Wales is that the prison population has doubled since 1993. Violence against the person actually makes up the largest group in England and Wales, so it's a very different picture to the US. But imprisonment for drugs offenses is higher than for sexual offenses, such as rape and assault. It's also higher than for robbery or burglary, and the volume of people sentenced for drug offenses has increased 166%. Now, it does bring up the question because, as I say, in a previous generation, probably when I was a younger person, I'm 38 now, by the way, we used the phrase victimless crime for a lot of these kinds of issues, which is something you really don't see very much of anymore, because I think that a lot of the debate, and certainly in Britain, has turned to whether or not these crimes are in fact victimless. There's a presumed social harm when it comes to public discussions around drug use and around sex work that is very often considered very high up in our list of concerns, these issues. For example, there is an assumption that the existence of sex work contributes to inequalities between men and women. There's an assumption that drug use, no matter if it's private, contributes to widespread criminality. And as far as the data go on that, it's very difficult to say whether or not that is in fact the case. A lot of researchers have tried to design studies to discern whether there is a cause and effect relationship between, say, drug use and criminality, and between, say, sex work and inequality of men and women per se. It's very difficult to tease out the difference between the effects that are related to the fact of the criminalization around these issues rather than the actual activities themselves. In general, the thinking that I have sort of come to, partly, I have to admit, because of my experience, but also from seeing other people's experiences, that as long as an action is not coercive or fraudulent, it's immoral to use force to stop it. Now, this is a view that in the legal picture in the UK is very at odds with, for example, the Spanner case, in which gay men were convicted of actual bodily harm for what turned out to be consensual S&M. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with this case, this was something in which prosecutors recovered videos which appeared to be people being tortured, and they assumed that these people were killed. And in spite of the fact that they then chased down all of the people who had appeared in the videos and found that they had consented to the activities, it was still decided that this activity was criminal. Looking through the cases in England and Wales on this matter, there's a lot of very confused judgments and no real clear division to what extent consensual activities of adults are actually illegal. Consensual branding in R versus Wilson was judged not to be a criminal act. And then for those of you who may have been following the cases that involved photographs of people sounding or photographs of people fisting, there's a lot of confusion in the cases that the CPS chooses to prosecute, and also accusations that they might be singling out particular activities that are favored by homosexual men, and whether or not this constitutes homophobia, institutionalized homophobia. Now, where is legalization appropriate versus where it's not? In general, the community of sex workers who advocate for legalization or decriminalization favor decriminalization over legalization. Obviously, there are also sex workers who oppose any kind of legal framework supporting sex work at all, but I'm not one of those. In general, workers feel that prohibitive licensing gives complete or almost complete control to the employers over themselves, that they're unable to organize, they're unable to unionize, and they're unable to pursue their rights. The sort of summary of which you could say, sex work is work like any other and ought to be treated as such. The fact that some people are abused within sex work is an issue separate to the treatment of it as work. Which maybe we'll explore a bit with questions afterwards. Certainly, there are high levels of stigma involved with sex work, which is what makes it very, very difficult for people to support any kind of strict legalization with registration outcomes. Obviously, there's a similar thing as well with drug users. People are very unwilling to put themselves on the list of approved drug users for fear of what that might do to any future employment prospects or just how people view them in general. So many people in these kinds of situations really prefer the free agency of working under pseudonyms, of it being the kind of work that you could leave behind. And I'll be quite honest, if I hadn't felt in 2009 that I was in a position where I had to reveal myself to the press or be revealed, I probably wouldn't have done. I had assumed, probably naively, that I was going to get away with it because I had got away with it for so long. And I very often joke to people, they said, "Oh, will you ever reveal who you are?" And I said, "Yeah, I'll do it as my retirement plan. I'll come out when I'm 65, write the tell-all book, and retire on that." And obviously, the best laid plans of mice and men, etc. Now, certainly, as specifically regards sex work, there's quite a lot of anti-migration stigma that enters into the conversation when we talk about anti-trafficking measures. There's also a lot of drug use stigma. This affects, as I've touched on, the available research in a lot of ways, partly because almost everybody who comes to these topics is not coming from a place of being totally objective. You tend to find that the people who research these topics are either people who have some connection with sex work that is positive in their past, or some connection with sex work that is negative in their past. And it's also very similar for research on drug use as well. There's quite a lot of talk in government about creating policy that is led by evidence, having evidence-led policy. Increasingly, what is being produced is evidence that is tailored to the policy that has already been decided. And we can see this very much the case with, for instance, the very recent cat ban that's now being belatedly debated in Commons as to whether or not there is actually any evidence of harm that goes along with that. A very sort of voguish terminology that you hear come up in a lot of discussions is ending demand. And I think probably in the questions we should talk about and explore, because I'd like the questions to be more of a discussion than questions really, whether it is actually ever possible to end demand for these things. Hands up anyone who knows who George Carlin is. You probably all do. I feel like I'm being incredibly patronizing by asking this. Fans of George Carlin? Anyone? Anyone? Just me then, excellent. Another connoisseur of fine 70s comedians. He has this joke about drugs, that if you took away all the drugs in the world, people would just spin themselves around in circles until they passed out, sort of indicating that there's literally no way to end demand for certain things. We all want to get off our faces at some point. One of the big sort of issues that came out when I personally came out is there's a lot of discussion about whether people are capable of consent. I think that we all agree that children can't meaningfully consent to particular actions, even if we probably don't agree on exactly where that line is. And of course, that's something that's much debated. Similarly, some mental disabilities affect consent. But beyond this, one thing that I found that was very interesting was after I came out, a tabloid that shall remain unnamed, the Mail on Sunday, went and located my estranged father. Now, he's a drug user. He is a crack addict, in fact. And this was something that happened after my parents divorced. And it was an incredible surprise to me, not that he was using drugs, I knew about that, but to find that people had decided based on that evidence that because my father had started using drugs when I was 25 years old, in my second year of my PhD, and had lived away from home for 10 years, that then equaled that I could not meaningfully consent to sex work, or that that was somehow the influential thing that had driven me to it. And I felt very offended, both as somebody who at that time identified as a feminist, and also just as a grown-up. I felt like a grown-up since I was 15, and here I was being told by the papers, no, something your dad did drove you to it. It felt like being robbed of my agency in a lot of ways. I kind of felt like I wanted to stand up and say, no, I have the right to make decisions other people hate. I have the right to make mistakes like everybody else does. Not that I would necessarily count as a mistake. But in general, this is something that we see again and again, where you see things like sex work and drug use criminalized. There was a case in Sweden, for example, of a 17-year-old boy, which in Swedish terms, that's somebody who is still a minor. So their age of consent is at 18. Is it at 18? Or it's 16 if you're within 2 years, Romeo and Juliet laws kind of thing. But in any case, he was somebody who, under normal circumstances, if it had not been paid sex, would have been considered not consenting within the law, but was prosecuted for buying sex with a sex worker in her 30s. And in essence, that judgment is saying that basically an adult woman is considered less competent than a teenage boy, which I found quite shocking. But this phenomenon of there being women as eternal victims and eternal children really follows any discussions of adults and consent around. And it's a significant problem. We're consistently told that there's a class or a group of people who know better than we do. I am very often told that there are people who know my circumstances better than I do, or who know my friends who are sex workers' situations better than they do. This really originates in the 19th century, where there was a moral and social hygiene movement that reclassified, in terms of sex work, the decision to enter sex work from being something that was a sin or a bad choice or an unladylike thing to do, to reclassifying the people who did this as almost being a different type of person, of there being a criminal class who engaged in these things. And this is something that has very much affected the debate ever since. You see this quite strikingly in the United States. If you go back to the 1860s, the 1870s, you have almost no laws regarding criminalization of different kinds of sex work anywhere in the US. By 1914, you have criminalization of both sides of the transaction, not only the people who are buying, but also the people who are selling almost everywhere. And if you were to ask yourself, what is it about that time period that would lead to such ideas having such currency throughout what is an incredibly complex quilt of legal systems, because you have not only the federal legal system in the state, but state and local legal systems, and obviously prostitution is not a federal crime. But you do have very widespread concern about the effects of migration, and also widespread concern about changes in visible female sexual behavior. And obviously, that is a discussion that we're having all the time now. These are two of the big issues that are preoccupying the headlines all of the time. So at the moment, what's very frustrating for people like me is the feeling that the discussion excludes people who are major stakeholders in the issues from the experiential point of view, which also often results in laws that actively are felt to harm them and to further alienate them from society, to have been declared somebody who has made a choice, who has crossed a line that can forever not be recrossed, and that's, that is something that'll follow you around forever. And I know certainly if I'm in the position of when I die, my lips to God's ears, may it be very far in the future, if there is an obituary written for me, undoubtedly the first thing about it will be a job that I did for 14 months. Now imagine, if you will, being known for something you did for 14 months. Maybe you worked at a checkout in Tesco and are forced to defend that for the rest of your life, and maybe that is the most significant thing that people remember about you. The flip side of that, of course, is absolutely dripping with privilege, as I am. I can't complain. I'm here being able to talk about it where many people are not. When people are alienated from society in this way, it becomes very simple to remove them altogether, to institutionalize, or to quote-unquote re-educate them. This happens both with addicts and with sex workers, and very often they are coerced into these situations, and very often these situations turn out to be not very productive and actually rehabilitating their behavior. If anyone truly believes that re-educating sex workers to become sweatshop workers is a blazing success in Cambodia, then I'd love to hear about it. Also as well, a lot of the discussion purposely ignores, as regards sex work, men who have sex with men, female buyers of sex work, trans sex workers, both male and female. There are a lot of similarities that people have observed in anti-sex work and anti-abortion rhetoric. There's a discussion of whether you can be truly pro-choice if you do not support the choice of a woman to sell sex if she prefers. And really, one thing that's absolutely dogged my experience is people talking about whether or not it is empowering. And I really wish that the word empowerment would die a death, because my feeling is that it's not relevant to the discussion. Whether or not a particular work is empowering should not affect how we feel about whether these workers have rights. It's really a straw man, and I would love it if that dies tonight. The final thing really is that there's a class aspect that really creeps into these discussions. Many people assume that indoor sex workers, like I was, have more choices than street-based ones, and the behavior around street-based sex work is very heavily criminalized, whereas I broke absolutely no laws, and the police are very unlikely to ever come knocking on my door, unlike the tax man. Similarly, with drugs, we have a lot of assumptions about people that have to do with class or also with money. Just before I came into this talk, for instance, we were talking about the accusations against Nigella Lawson and her drug use, which she has today admitted to. We do tend to give the benefit of the doubt to people who seem very together, to people who tick certain boxes in terms of money and in terms of class. We tend to make problems out of lager louts, whereas swilling a box of wine when you get home is perfectly fine, even if you're passing out on your sofa every night. And this also affects, of course, in terms of policy, where we go with issues like sin taxes, which obviously affect the bottom line of people on lower incomes more than they would people on higher incomes. So in general, the problem with that is characterizing people who come to the table with disadvantages as potentially unable to meaningfully consent. And this is a problem for fighting disadvantages in general. It potentially creates a two-tier system, as absolutely exists with sex work and probably exists with drug use as well. When we consider consent giving to be contingent upon a permitted intersection of choices and circumstance, we essentially consign the majority of people to non-personhood in the eyes of policy. Also, historically, where rights have been denied to particular groups of people, it never really stops there. If rights are denied to particular drug users because we perceive them to be a threat, it never stops with that group. If rights are denied to particular groups of sex workers because we perceive them to be a threat, they're almost always extended to women in general. And this is especially true if you look at the issue with Ireland and the Magdalen laundries, where women were institutionalized for being sex workers, then they were institutionalized for having children out of wedlock, then they were institutionalized for any kind of overt sexual behavior that upset anyone in the public eye, and eventually people could be put in and institutionalized for life for almost anything at all. It's a massive scandal. Only this year have the Irish government apologized for it, and the orders that were involved with it have never apologized and will not be making restitution to the few remaining survivors. And this is a situation where there are unnamed bodies and there are mass graves. So that's pretty much it, really. I think that we should probably open the floor and have a chat about these issues, because I'm more interested in the back and forth than answering questions.